but. So while a modern Christianized reading of gift, perhaps connected to Protestant understandings of grace, may imply an almost ambivalence toward reciprocal receipt, issues of reciprocity are contained within the genealogy of the concept. If there is a link between gift and a short circuit between giver and the recipient, it is often described as a contemporary frustration, not a ubiquitous understanding of how gifting works or how gifts function. It is here then that one finds, for instance, Jacques Derrida's fascination with the gift as a sort of impossibility. Gift is usually conceptualized in the modern world as something which does not call for a return, something which interrupts the circularity of economy as an economic concept, which refuses to give in to the continual circularity of common practice. Furthermore, for Derrida, beyond just being outside of economy, the gift represents the impossibility, an archetype of impossibility itself. The impossibility is apparent when it is noted that gifting often demands an implicit contract between two subjects. Right? I mean, everyone's gotten something for Christmas, and maybe you forgot to get the other person something, not even a card, and you feel like a real jerk, and so you have to make it up in some way, right? I mean, that's sort of the feeling that we often get about gifts, is that we have to make it up, usually in sort of an implicit way. The exchange of a thing from one subject to another calls for the second subject to accord, lend, or give some attention and some meaning to what the donor allots. So, like, even if you don't give anything back, you have to say thank you, right? You have to say, oh, I really appreciate this. What a great Amazon Echo. I'm not going to use it, but thank you. It's great. Derrida is concerned with the seeming tautology involved in common outworking of the gift. And regarding this, he points explicitly to the impossibility of the gift as such. For the gift to exist there, in fact, must be no reciprocity, return, exchange, countergift, or debt. He goes on to say, quote, if the other gives me back or owes me or has to give me back what I give him or her, there will not have been a gift. Whether this restitution is immediate or whether it is programmed by a complex calculation of a long-term deferral or difference, the gift is annulled each time there is restitution of countergift, end quote. But here's, of course, there's a question of anachronism, right? And then the further question of whether we need to bother with the alleged dangers of anachronism when dealing with possible Pauline reconstructions of this type. Recent social historical approaches to the New Testament documents in general, and Paul in particular, such as David Briones' Paul's Financial Policy, brings into question Derrida's critical inquiry into the nature of gift. In fact, you pick up any book on Paul and grace or gift, and there's going to be some reference to Derrida and someone moaning about him. So he continually comes up in these works. This reciprocity that Derrida mentions, that he uses to chisel away at the fault lines of conceptions of gifting, is there explicitly, however. As Barclay, Briones, Thomas Blanton, who happens to be Ward Blanton's brother, who is an amazing New Testament scholar, have worked on ancient concepts of gifting, grace, and benefaction, have noted, and as can be seen in Seneca, Hesiod, and other ancient writers, and anthropological work that's there's almost always expectations of a return in benefactive practices, even though these practices can be wildly diverse in the ancient world. There just is no strong concept of the type of modern gift that doesn't ask for something in return, even in the New Testament texts that have been the source for theologies of grace that emphasize the free nature of grace. So, I mean, perhaps most of you, if you're aware of anything about Protestant theology, you're aware of this kind of notion of grace as this free gift. Just accept the free gift of Jesus, or whatever. But grace and benefaction and gifting don't work like that in the ancient world. There's always a bit of a give and take of some sort, even with God in the New Testament documents. I don't think that if someone gifted me that t-shirt that I would be quite happy, though. I don't think I would return anything, not even a thank you. So grace, gift, and benefaction, they're all about circularity in the ancient world, as well as maintaining social harmony. In one sense, this seems to have nothing to do at all with class struggle, right? Especially if we were thinking of class struggle in a very narrow manner. But in another sense, I think there could be a very interesting link between gift and class struggle, and this may be seen precisely in taking note of another ancient figure contemporaneous with Seneca, Paul of Tarsus. Yay, we finally come to Paul. And his forms of community that scholars like Neil Eliot, Larry Welburn, and others have read is constituting a form of mutualism that co-opts ancient forms of relations and retracts from other certain social forms, including, for instance, giving due to the Roman Empire. So if you're aware, there's this lively discussion going on, of course, in New Testament studies about, is Paul anti-imperial? Or are we reading things into Paul and he was actually just cozy with the empire and all this kind of stuff? But, as was mentioned in the first section, there have been numerous works that have attempted to detail the social composition of early Christian communities. So-called New Consensus works by the likes of Wayne Meeks, Gerd Thiessen, and others have reckoned that, for the most part, these communities probably consisted of a majority of below subsistence and subsistence peoples, and also many elite or near-elite individuals who would, for the most part, help to sustain these communities. Justin Meggitt, as I mentioned earlier, published a trenchant critique of this in 1997, that picked holes in some of the evidence used by the New Consensus Fellows, and noted that, for the most part, we can talk of society being made up of kind of familiar percentage going on here. The 99%, those that are near subsistence or below subsistence, and the 1% of elites. And this started a lively, scholarly conversation that's continuing on today. So new models of this by people like Stephen Friesen and Walter Scheibel, who's a really well-known dude who works on Rome, Roman economy, Roman slavery, or slavery in Rome, and classics people would know. They created new models that try to distinguish between different levels of social stratification in ancient Rome, building from earlier models by Friesen that centered on urban populations only, and also on early Christian groups in particular, with varying degrees of accuracy. I mean, obviously varying degrees of accuracy. This is 2,000 years ago. We don't have a whole lot of evidence to think about these things. However, even with new models created, often postulating around 7 different levels of economic scale, the levels of elites, so-called ES 1 through 3, maintains at about the same level, moving from 1 to 3%, according to recent work done. So it doesn't change much. No matter what you're talking about, we're talking about 1 to 3% and 99 to 97% or so, of just a giant stratification here, or giant division. Despite these various models, Meggitt's work is important because he uses available evidence to point to survival strategies among urban, impoverished peoples, and use this evidence to talk about early Pauline congregations as examples of mutualism, but also as social forms that retract from daily life in specific ways. However, with the remaining things I'm going to try to get through, instead of focusing on imprecise or precise, who knows, reconstructions of possible socioeconomic levels found in Pauline assemblies, as many are wont to do, I want to attend to the formation of equitable communities through tweaks on social practices like patronage, especially, and patron-client relations and reciprocity generally. I think this then is where we can find a peculiar and important example of community in Paul that forms a basis for theorizing relational humanity. Instead of attending to Paul in a manner that results in reading reductively, or seeing the concrete actions or the social historical occasions as the mechanical action of an actor reduced to pure contingency, someone plugged into a model. Noting the equity within the images and specific practices of Pauline communal formation allow hermeneutical paths to open up both for directing social historical possibilities. In contrast to sketches of Paul that detail a theology ethic that is mostly intracommunal or only concerned with particular assemblies, Neil Eliot, the guy we noted earlier, notes a broader motif in Romans, this epistle that Paul writes to communal Christians in Rome, where he looks at chapters 12 through 15 and regards these as kind of a substantially changed section from the rest of the letter, and that it kind of focuses on something different than the apocalyptic logic that's found in 1 through 11. That's just a broad brush, I'm sorry. As Eliot notes, the quote, eschatological horizon is fundamentally at odds with the Roman vision of the nations united in offering tribute to Caesar, and clashes inevitably with the cultic performances meant to unite all peoples in worshipful subservience to Rome, end quote. It does so by uniting in a way that is fundamentally at odds with the social logic of the ideological forces at work. Instead, a vision of hierarchy is confronted through not thinking highly of oneself and contributing to the needs of the saints and extending hospitality to strangers, and as Eliot glosses Romans 12 through 16, making one's way with the oppressed. So this motif of sort of social relations is quite a bit at odds with the usual way of navigating first century social boundaries and viewing the nexus of the person within the broader social scape. And if those who note Paul's focus on empire are correct, then this is what one would expect in the epistle to the Romans. The tension that Eliot underscores is not controversial, of course, and neither does it take substantial straining for scholars to point at possible anti-imperial elements within Pauline thought. In fact, one does not even have to make a strong case that Paul is engaging in directly subversive behavior with shrewdly directed goals. You know, maybe Paul is doing something different than being a Che Guevara or a typical kind of what we think of when we think of revolutionary, or someone who's being kind of transgressive or subversive. What Eliot's insistence does rely on is the assumption that Paul, whether readying for an imminent apocalyptic recreation of reality or not, is employing an ethic of solidarity, which flips the social body and reimagines the spatial play of social interaction, engaging perhaps in a form of class struggle by transgressing social expectations. The imagery here, when noting the motif that Eliot points out, is interesting, but a more pointed coterie of metaphors can be seen in 2 Corinthians, which again focuses on Paul's collection project. Because of time, these can only be gestured toward, but in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, there's a large section where Paul talks about the importance of benefaction, grace, gifting, telling his people he's writing to, or that is being read aloud to the congregation, that they are part of a wider mutualistic and equity-based economy, or koinonia. These scenes are interesting. They consist in a sort of joyful emptying out during difficult circumstances within association, so poor communities giving everything they have, a sort of meditation on Jesus' emptying of self through benefaction language, and a transceptive section which echoes equality through calling forth to his hearers Yahweh's provision to the wandering Israelites. So lots of interesting stuff going on in this single chapter, chapter 8. In all of this, Paul, I think, notes the dynamism of his project, the inner logic that constitutes relations between his various communities, but we can also see the subsumption of the communities under a logic of lack through which their mutual relational strategies are viewed as a sort of auto-gifting. My own term. I made my own term up. That makes me feel like a real scholar. Auto-gifting. Wait, has someone else used that before? Well, I guess I win. Whereby the individually dual nature of the exchange is hidden through lack. So in these sections, through the abundance of God, there is a continuous duty of giving, emptying out, being enacted between the agents of the communities. And while these communities are disparate and often dislocated from one another, they're fundamentally connected as a sort of amorphous social body. And their connection is found precisely through their emptying into one another. So in the moment of emptying, it is the lack which connects the sections of the body. In this sense, a sort of auto-gifting is taking place, or that's what I mean by auto-gifting. So this brief sketch connects to the ethic of solidarity, providing a picture of a community of abundance, but also lack, drawing on Paul's overall emphasis on power through weakness, through withdrawing from the social scene in their particular context. While, for instance, Paul's citation of the manna section of Exodus seems minor, placed next to the imagery pointing to solidarity allows the brief reference to be transformed into a textual citation that points to not only equality under the provider of manna, which is Paul's God, but also the importance of social cohesion among the diverse members. So the auto-gifting is enacted by an abundant patron. But in the case of the Corinthian provision, an ethic of solidarity can be discerned in the functioning of the different parties that are crucial to the play of resources. So in Paul's sort of theological language, God is the one who's providing the abundance, but in the actual social material analysis, it's the people that are doing it. We can say it's God working through the people or whatever, but materially it's sort of this kind of continual emptying out, emptying into one another. So something a bit different. Instead of the Corinthians playing the part of the patron, there's a social flattening to the abundance of a separate party, in this case, Paul's deity, God, Yahweh, whatever. Like the Macedonians mentioned in 2 Corinthians 8:2, the Corinthians are called to enter into the social role of the broker, a mediating third actor passing on the resources to the receiver of the collective resources. So in this sense, a hierarchical relationship is obscured through this sort of relational model, and it allows for a more coherent ethic of solidarity. I don't know if that made any sense to anybody, but it was recorded. So if you want to listen to it later, I guess you could. This is a recurring theme in Paulin's writing, and it is notable that while there may be negotiations among Paul's overall theological ethical concerns, the solidarity displayed is present in not only the Corinthian correspondence, but also in Paul's final writing, which we have already noted, Romans. As the previous elaboration of Eliot expressed, solidarity is a central theme in Romans, dictating a running thread throughout Paul's communal project. It is true as well that community or communality can be interpreted as mundane in Paul's loose context. While making sure not to give in to Orientalist fantasies, sustained work has gone into developing social scientific critiques of the New Testament world, much of which is focused on the strict binary of collectivist versus individualistic societies, with the world of the New Testament falling into the former category. If so, a superficial remark would turn on the obviousness of a collectivistic group, attaining some form of communality. Doing so, however, I think empties the previous Paulinist images of their context, and especially of their societal radicality. Furthermore, social relations are not just structured, reduced to moments here, but instead rely upon a specific ethic that points to a possible ontological structure, augmenting the subjective content of what it is to be human. You can take that or leave it. So that's pretty much everything I had written, and I hope that it makes sense. And I think I recognize the holes here. There's only so much you can do in 3,700 words, particularly in how I start with class struggle, and it may not be as explicit in my last section, but I hope that you kind of caught on to what was going on in that last section, which was a bit more complicated than the previous sections, and that is precisely the sort of like short-circuiting that Paul, or my reading of Paul, is trying to do to social structures and to harmony. And I think I can make a much more explicit case if I had time, but there it is. Thank you.